Hello, everyone, and you're very welcome to this evening's readings. A couple of short extracts from the novel entitled The Things We Know Now. What a glorious day it has been. Up until very recently, just outside my window, somebody was playing a guitar, so you might even get a little bit of musical accompaniment. Okay, the only thing you need to know really at this point of the novel is that this section is told in the voice of Patrick, who, when the novel opens, is a man in his mid-70s. He's married for the second time to a woman called Ella, and they have a son, Daniel. But Patrick was married once before in his 30s. His wife, Cecilia, died. They had 3 daughters, and one of them, the eldest, is Rebecca. So some things have happened in Patrick's life recently, and he's looking back over his life and doing a little bit of reflecting about maybe how he could have done things better in his younger years. So this is he remembering a particular event with Rebecca when she was only 5 years of age, and the impact that this particular event had on his relationship with her and indeed on the rest of his life. I had not always been a model husband to Cecilia, a fact that Rebecca made sure to mention from time to time. As the eldest child by a good 5 years, she had become privy to some, shall we say, difficulties between her mother and myself that had been resolved long before the twins were born. Rebecca had always been an observant child, although Cecilia used to insist that all children see and understand way more than we give them credit for. Listening at doors, creeping around late at night, sitting at the top of the stairs, overhearing their parents' heedless conversations. Oh yes, children hear far more than they are intended to. And Rebecca had probably had more opportunity than most. Always precocious, she'd ruled the roost for all that time before the arrival of her twin sisters. Mothers tended not to work outside the home in those days, and so Rebecca had had Cecilia's undivided attention for, arguably, the most formative years of her life. As a result, she had become her mother's champion very early on, and remained so until Cecilia's sudden and untimely death. I remember, and I suspect that Rebecca does too, that one seminal moment in our father-daughter relationship. As I write this, I realise that it must be all of 43 years ago. It was certainly Christmas Eve, and Rebecca was still only 4, although within a few months of her 5th birthday. I am ashamed to say that at that time I had been captivated by a willowy young woman, a secretary or personal assistant, as political correctness would have it now, who had come to work for me, for my business partner Matt and me, to be precise, about 6 months earlier. I know now, of course, that Cecilia suspected our affair, and that my absence from the bosom of my family on such a special day must have confirmed it. When I finally arrived home at about 8 in the evening, I had a store of excuses ready. Last-minute drinks with colleagues, the difficulty as the boss of extricating myself from the raucous seasonal celebrations, the impossibility of getting a taxi anywhere in the run-up to Christmas, you know, the kind of thing. As it happened, I had spent the afternoon in Janet's flat, specifically in Janet's cramped and uncomfortable bed, and left when her tears had become tiresome. My affair with Janet, I have to confess, had followed a pattern that by then had become all too predictable. The initial delicious shock of mutual discovery, the heady potency of secret trysts, and finally, tears and clinging and the inevitable plea for commitment. I should have known better. Indeed, perhaps I did. That day, it seemed to me that I was merely playing a role, but one that had finally taken on a life of its own. And so, as I extricated myself later on that evening, it was with a feeling composed almost entirely of relief. A small amount of regret, perhaps, but nothing that could dampen my sense of having escaped. In fact, I did have considerable difficulty getting a taxi. I even had difficulty making my way along the crowded footpaths, pulsing with shoppers and gawkers and drunken youths. I arrived home some 2 hours after I had planned to, dishevelled and irritated. Rebecca met me in the hallway and she was angry. She glared at me, both fists clenched by her side. Before I had time to say hello, she marched towards me and unfurled one small hand. I bent down to lift her, to hug her, to swing her in the way that she liked, but she moved faster. She smacked me hard, right across the cheek. For a moment, I was speechless. All I could see was her furious face, her brown eyes already beginning to fill. "You made my mummy cry," she said. "I hate you." And she fled upstairs, slamming the door of her bedroom behind her. I stood in the hall, helpless, looking after her small figure, still seeing her white socks as she disappeared around the turn in the stairs. All my irritation leached away. In its place, a searing sense of my daughter's vulnerability began to flood me, making the light dance in front of my eyes. Those small white socks, the determined hands, the tears trembling on her lower lashes. And for the first time in many years, I felt ashamed. It was as though that slap had loosened all that was decent in me, all that had lain dormant for far too long. I made up my mind there and then. Now I understood St. Paul on the road to Damascus. But mine was no thunderbolt, rather a calm, single moment of clarity, a moment that unpicked all the seams of my life, tearing the fabric in two. There was before and there was after. It was as blunt, as simple, as clearly illuminative as that. On that evening, I became transformed into a man with a new and urgent sense of purpose. I walked into the kitchen, where Cecilia was sitting at the table, a cup of tea in front of her. Her eyes were reddened, her face lined with unhappiness. I pulled her gently to her feet, took her in my arms. She resisted, and I held her more tightly. I needed to speak, and I needed to speak now. I could not let this moment pass. "It's over," I said. "I promise you, it's over." She meant nothing to me, nothing at all. How many cliches can one man utter? The fact that it was true, that it was all true, what I had said and what I was about to say, didn't make it any better. As I stood there, holding Cecilia as she battled a fresh storm of weeping, I did indeed discard Janet, if I had not already done so earlier that afternoon. "Forgive me, Cecilia, please," I said. "It won't happen again. You're the one I love. I'll make it up to you, I promise." She stepped back from my embrace. I could feel her slowing down her breathing. Her hands, just like Rebecca's, were now clenched at her side. "I can't do this any longer, Patrick." She spoke over my shoulder, her gaze averted. "You have to decide." Her voice was choked. Her pain was an almost physical presence between us as she struggled to form the words. "It's us or it's the others. You can't have both." I was startled. She saw me flinch. Her eyes filled with challenge, widened in disbelief. "You think I didn't know? You think you were so clever that you hid your tawdry little affairs? You think you fooled me?" She was suddenly alight with all the pain of my betrayals. I had no reply other than the one that still makes me cringe, even all these years later. "I never meant to hurt you." I made to move closer to her, both arms already open in supplication. But she stepped away from me, her hands on my chest, pushing me back. I could feel the white heat of her contempt through my shirt. "Choose, Patrick," she said. Despite her distress, her tear-stained face, she stood up straighter, lifted her defiant chin. Choose now. Either you pack your bags and leave, or you decide to be a proper husband and father. I am not living like this, nor will I have my daughter live like this. She moved even further away from me. I was frightened then. I felt if she left the room, I would have lost her, that she would have made the decision for me. But she stayed. Her face was now closed. I already knew the anger that lived there. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet, but it was impossible to ignore the steel in her tone. You've always wanted a son, or so you say. She paused, looking directly at me, her expression almost puzzled, as though she was trying to figure out something particularly stupid that I had said or done. Has it never occurred to you why we have no more children? Don't you even ask yourself why there hasn't been another baby? I opened my mouth to reply and closed it again. Clearly, she was going to tell me, and I wanted the full force of her rage. I welcomed it. I felt it might cleanse me. Because I will not bring another child into, she spread her hands to indicate the kitchen as though everything around us was further sullied proof of all my treacherous impulses, my lack of faithfulness to her. Into this, she wiped tears away angrily. Decide and decide now. I did. I stayed, of course. I may be many things, but a fool is not one of them. It was a very strange time in my life. I see it now through the prism of all my lived years as a discrete episode, bookended by Cecilia's and my wedding day, some 5 years earlier in the summer of 1964, and by the Christmas Eve to which I now refer. It seemed to me, even at the time of our marriage, and certainly in retrospect, that no sooner had I committed myself to one woman for life then all the old shackles of fidelity and buttoned down, stifling suburban lives began to fall away all around me. The world was in turmoil. It was changing beyond all recognition. Certainties were being felled like ninepins. Beliefs were being stripped bare, traditions shorn of their falseness. I loved Cecilia, never doubted that I loved her and she me. But it seemed to me then, as a man in my early 30s, that my marriage had been the result of the worst possible timing on my part. Just when all the world was breaking free, I had made myself a prisoner, a square, a victim of, well, whatever the prevailing rhetoric was at the time around governments, the patriarchy, the stifling noose of conformity. Even though Cecilia and I had enough money, more than most young couples, because her father had seen to that, and even though we enjoyed the same things, books, theatre, music, Cecilia was a superb pianist. I became instantly restless. That whole decade had been a restless one. The blossoming of free love, flower power, the exuberant loosening of all those burdens that had defined our parents' small and meagre existences. I wanted a slice of that freedom for myself. Overnight, I felt trapped by the husbandliness of my life, and soon by the demands of fatherhood. And so I strayed. Tawdry little affairs, Cecilia had said. She'd no idea how close to the mark her description was. I seemed to seek out in that parallel life things that I would neither tolerate nor even contemplate in my real one. Later that Christmas Eve evening, Cecilia went up to Rebecca's bedroom and brought the unwilling child downstairs with her. We did a reasonable job, I believe, of placating her, or at least Cecilia did. I kept a physical distance from my daughter that night. I thought it right to respect her anger. We said all the usual things parents tell children in situations like this, that sometimes mummies and daddies fight, even when they care for each other, that we both loved her very much, that daddy had promised not to make mummy cry ever again. I repeated that promise to my small daughter, carefully, slowly, until I judged that she was ready to believe me. It was a solemn moment that eventually ended in a hug, albeit a wary one on Rebecca's part. and several bedtime stories. I kept my promise. From those very rocky shores, Cecilia and I forged a long and loving relationship. I never cheated again. A psychologist might make much of this, I suppose, that I had kept on and on doing what I was doing until I was found out, that at some level I wanted to be found out, that it gave me permission to return to my life, a life that had been waiting patiently in the wings, waiting for me to grow up, that my parallel life had become tired and meaningless, as much of a burden as the one I believed I'd been trying to cast off. All I'd wanted, in the end, was to come home. Okay, that's it for this evening. Next week, on Tuesday at 7:30, I will read another extract from this same novel, and this one from the point of view of Rebecca. There are several viewpoints in the novel. There's 9 voices in all. I'll read 2 more next week, and then for the month of May, we'll move on to another book. In the meantime, keep well, everybody. Keep safe and stay home. Bye for now.